Hello, everybody. Welcome again to TheiaCon 2021, and thank you to Tim de Boer, who is the chair of the Cloud Dev Tools Steering Committee, for his nice introduction. Thank you again, Tim. Before I introduce our first speaker, who I'm sure many of you know, I just want to make one quick announcement, and that is in order to be in with a chance of winning some goodies, we have some prizes to give away today and tomorrow. It's very simple. Please head on over to Twitter, follow the ECD Tools account. So that's all one word, ECD Tools. And then throughout the day, tweet your impressions, your thoughts, whatever you want, hopefully nice things about the event, using the hashtag TheiaCon 2021. So hope to see you all over there on Twitter. And I'll also be posting a link to join our Slack workspace, where there will be more conversation over the next 2 days. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Jonas, Dr. Jonas Helming. He's the general manager of Eclipse Source, as well as a consultant, trainer, and software engineer. His focus is on web-based development tools, IDEs, modeling, and the Eclipse ecosystem. Jonas is the author of a book and numerous articles about the Eclipse ecosystem. He is an active member of the community, of course, and currently leading 2 projects and involved in many others. Very recently, he was recognized as Eclipse Top Newcomer Evangelist and is a regular speaker at conferences including JAX, OOP, WJAX, and EclipseCon. Over to you, Jonas. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for the very nice introduction. I don't have any more to add. Welcome from my side. I'm honored to be the first speaker at TheiaCon this year. The motivation for this talk actually came from 2 directions. As Brian just mentioned, me as a consultant and we as a company, Eclipse Source, we actually help our customers to build tools and IDEs. And in recent years, a lot of these tools are actually based on web technologies, and in particular based on Eclipse Theia. So we have participated in quite a few projects that started to adopt Theia. On the other hand, since the beginning of this year, I'm honored to be one of the project leads of Theia. So I'm also in contact from the project point of view with new people starting to adopt Theia. Now, in this process, there are a couple of recurring questions that new adopters of the project have, like frequently recurring questions from an organizational point of view, from a technical point of view, how to communicate with the project, how to technically consume Theia as a technology, and so on. And that was actually the motivation of this talk. And in the next 45 minutes, I will try to answer the most frequent questions that, from my experience, new adopters of the Theia project have. My hope is that I will answer some of your questions you might have if you're in the process of adopting Theia, or if you're thinking about adopting Theia. If it's very likely that I don't answer all your questions, so there will be a short Q&A after I'm done with my talk. And if that's not enough, feel free to talk to me in the evening in the Q&A section, or just get in contact with me or anybody else of the project. So we are happy to help anyone. And about the structure of the talk, it's basically a list of questions. I try to order them a little bit so it makes sense, but sometimes there's a little bit of a topic break, so please excuse that. But first of all, welcome to the ecosystem. It's glad that you're interested in Theia, at least, otherwise you would not be here today. Be aware that you're not the only one here. It's already a huge community, and it's growing every day. You see quite some known companies here. It's a good mixture of big companies and smaller companies that are adopting Theia. But also be aware, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, these are just the companies we know of and that have put their logos on website. As a matter of fact, we know that there's probably much larger group of companies adopting Theia that we don't officially know of. Sometimes we get in contact with them, which is very interesting, but not every company wants to put their logo on the website. If you're adopting Theia, I invite you to do so, because that shows the world that use Theia, and it's also good for the project. Also be aware that there are a lot of tools already out there built on Theia. Some like well-known examples from SAP, the Business Application Studio, new version, the Google Cloud Shell. From ARM, we have Embed Studio and Carl Studio. Obviously, Red Hat Code Ready Workspaces, or CHE, that's the open source version. The new Arduino IDE is built on Theia, Code Anywhere, Logic Cloud, D-Wave Leap, and quite a large number of more tools that you can look at to see what's possible with Theia, and maybe to get some ideas for your own tool. All right, let's directly dive into the first question. I want to keep that short. Hopefully you have some idea what Theia is, but let's do a quick definition so that we're on the same page what we're talking about. So Theia is a platform for building web-based tools and IDEs. Platform is important here. Theia itself is not a tool. In the meantime, we provide a downloadable version of Theia. I will tackle that a little bit later, but Theia is really meant as a platform. So the goal is to support you in implementing your own custom tool or IDE. And what does the platform consist of? Many things, but I want to focus on three most important key aspects. Theia provides a basic workbench frame. That's a window management, like we see on the right side, where you can put in views, editors, menus, commands, and so on. You can drag things around. You can basically put together a typical UI of a tool, and you don't have to start from scratch, but there is an existing workbench to start with that you can still customize, but it provides some default for you to fill with your own UI. Second, very important, a modular extension mechanism. Like the Eclipse desktop version and most platforms, this is a key aspect because a modular system or a modular extension mechanism allows you to combine existing features that are provided by the framework with your own features. And the key aspect here is reuse. You don't have to implement everything from scratch, but instead you just pick a couple of modules that are already there, add your own modules or extensions as they're called in Theia, and then you compile everything and you have your own custom tool. So this enables reuse. And third, I implicitly mentioned that Theia provides quite a lot of common tool features that you can just reuse. So you don't have to implement them, things like a file explorer, a terminal, a debug view, a code editor, outline view, and many, many more. So if you build a typical tool or IDE, you can probably reuse a large portion of that and only focus on the things that are custom for your specific domain or tool. Now, how to get started with Theia? What are good entry points to the project? I want to mention there are many more, but I want to focus on 4 entry points. Read the online documentation. It has been criticized for quite a long time that there's not much documentation on the website. Thanks to contribution from ST Microelectronics, this has changed during the last 2 or 3 months. There are quite a lot of articles about the core APIs, the core concepts of Theia. So I invite you to read that through. It will probably provide you a good jumpstart on Theia and how to do things in Theia. Same is true, by the way, for the API documentation, which has been improved a lot over the last year. If you want to get started, use the Theia extension generator. That allows you to create Theia extensions based on templates, like, for example, a widget or a hello world. But in addition, even if you don't want to go for Theia extensions, we will cover that later. It allows you to scaffold a Theia-based product. So if you want to get started with your own coding project, this is a good start because it just gives you a project structure to start with. And you will have a startable Theia application within a minute or so. Definitely ask questions on the forum. Our community forum, we are very happy, is very active. So questions are answered by different contributors. We have some heroes which answer a lot of questions there. So definitely, if you have any questions, ask them there. We are happy to help you. And I want to take the opportunity to thank all the contributors and committers that spent the hard work there to answer questions from the community. But in turn, this is also very interesting for us to learn what questions are open or what are people doing. And finally, I compiled a frequently asked questions blog article 2 years ago, and I regularly update that to the current state. So that provides another overview of some questions you might have initially and some pointers. All right, let's dive a little bit more into technical details, how to consume Theia in your project. So how can you start to build a Theia-based project? I will not go too much into technical details. We have other talks during this conference covering that, but I will stay more on a conceptual level. Now, if you want to create a Theia-based product, as I mentioned before, that's actually typically a mixture between modules that are already there and some new components that you write yourself and that you add to that. And that's how you actually build up your Theia-based product. So typically you start with some Theia extensions. That's the module concept native for Theia. For example, Theia core, maybe Git support, stuff like that. So a couple of extensions that create the basis of your tool. So you configure them into your product. You might add a number of VS Code extensions. That's possible. Theia supports VS Code extensions to add additional features from this ecosystem. And now how to configure that? So you need some sort of artifact to configure what's in your product. And that's what we call a product config. And that is I would say the minimal artifact you need in your own project. So if you think about your workspace when you start a Theia-based product, you will at least have this product config that tells, okay, these are the Theia extensions and VS Code extensions I want to have in my product. And it's actually valuable. You could also just create a product based on existing components. That's also completely fine. Then you just configure a product. However, if you want to add some custom features, you would also add new Theia extensions or new VS Code extensions, which would then be part of your workspace too. And the product config basically then contains a list of existing components and your own components. Now, what's the typical project layout? How does that map to source code? Now, this is what you will get when you use the Yeoman generator, and it's a typical monorepo layout, which is probably the best way to get started. You can still split things later on, but this is kind of standard and very convenient to develop. So you typically have a package JSON on the root that is basically just for configuring your source workspace and listing all the other things that are in there. So that's not really important. You typically have a subdirectory for every extension that you develop, and then a package JSON for every extension describing the dependencies and like development or the specifying this extension particularly. And then you can have one or more products, and by convention, these are called either browser app, again with a package JSON, or Electron app, depending on whether you're building for the browser or for Electron. And now, in terms of content, so the root basically is a configuration artifact listing all the workspaces here. So, for example, that you can execute a global build. The extension package JSON configures this particular extension, this module, including the dependencies of this extension and the entry point, namely a so-called module. That's a technical detail. And the browser app and the Electron app basically list as dependencies the things that are now part of your product. So we see here, for example, we have Theia core in, and we also have our extension in there. And then if you build this, you will end up with an actual browser application. And the same is true for the Electron app. So this is the very prototypical project layout you probably want to get started with. I just mentioned you can build Theia for Electron or for browser. So that means you can write desktop applications or cloud applications with Theia. How is that possible? The typical or the architecture of a Theia-based tool is as follows. From a very high level point of view, we have a front end and a back end in any deployment. Front end is running on the browser engine. It's written in HTML and TypeScript. And the backend is running on a Node.js process. You can integrate other processes there too, like Java or C, for example, for compilers, for language servers, and so on. But Theia conceptually has this split between the front end and the back end. And now you can either deploy it as currently on the slide, then you would have a cloud deployment with a client and a server. You can also bundle both together and then use Electron to basically deploy this as a desktop application. So both is possible. It's worth noting that you can, if you want to do both, you can share most of the code or almost all the code. There are some subtle differences, for example, for file dialogues versus download and so on. But it's pretty simple with Theia to actually provide the same application as both. You have to test it in both scenarios. Now, what is the typical motivation to go for desktop or cloud? So desktop users get what they are probably currently used to. For example, if you have an existing desktop tool, you might not shock your users with directly going to the browser, but rather going to a modern front end first. You still have modern rendering because the front end is written in HTML and rendered by a browser engine. But you still have this local setup necessary. So that means users still have to configure the machine, download the tool, install, and so on. On the other hand, in the online version, very obviously, you ease the setup if you do it right. So users just have to click a link and then they are ready to code for onboarding. There are some potential business models around that. So, for example, you could provide your tool as a service or even do something crazy, like, for example, if you're in an embedded area, have an online data center with devices to deploy to and stuff like that. So there's a lot of potential to go to the cloud. However, you have to be aware of that going to the cloud is a significant effort for the infrastructure. And the reason is you somewhere have to host the backend then. And hosting a developer backend is more complex than just hosting a plain web application typically, because developers need a lot of power in what they do. Like they need to compile stuff, start applications. So basically they are kind of roots on any machine. So you have to encapsulate the backend and basically manage the setup there. There are solutions for that, for example, Che, but it's definitely effort to set that up and also to maintain that. And also, like, be aware that this might sometimes conflict with security and IP governance. So some companies might not be able to commit the code to an online solution. So you might even need to provide on-premise an on-premise version of your online hosting again. So in a nutshell, online is probably the most interesting option because it has so much potential, but it's not something that you do overnight. What actually most or many vendors that we know of do is they kind of follow a dual strategy. They go web-based on the desktop first, meaning with Electron, to basically switch to the new technology stack first, and then in parallel work on a cloud offering, bring that out maybe a little bit later or maybe at the same time. That really depends on the project. But with Theia, the good thing is you have the freedom. Like you can do both. You can prepare the cloud offering with a desktop tool first. So it will support your strategy wherever you want to go. How to deploy Theia. Again, I will not go too much into technical details, but just in a nutshell, the good way to get started with this is the Yeoman template. It will generate a browser-based build and an Electron build for you. So again, in those two directories, browser app and Electron app, which you can actually use and then deploy. Now, for the browser-based version, you probably want to tweak the Webpack build there a bit with minification, for example. For the Electron build, you might want to have an installer for your desktop application because it will just output the binaries. The good news for that is there is a template on how to create desktop installers for a Theia-based product, and that's Eclipse Theia Blueprint. Blueprint is actually an example tool that the Eclipse Theia project provides. It was a collaboration between ARM, ST Microelectronics, Eclipse Source, and Ericsson. And the idea of this tool is actually twofold. It allows you to just download Theia vanilla. I mean, I mentioned before that Theia is actually not a tool, but there was always this request, okay, where can we just test it? Like, I mean, we want to evaluate the platform before we actually adopt it. And Theia Blueprint serves this need. So it's an example tool, and that's why it's called Blueprint, based on Theia. You can download it, you can install it, and basically even use it for development. So for example, I use it for development. But at the same time, because the source code or the configuration for the build of Theia Blueprint is completely open source, you can use it as a template or a blueprint for your own product. So if you want to build such a product based on Theia, you can look at Blueprint, maybe change the configuration, adapt it to your needs. And that is especially also includes how to create installers for a Theia-based application. So yeah, that's what Blueprint actually serves. Next question that often comes, or hopefully most project comes up next, is how to test Theia-based application. So I will not go into detail like how to really test applications, but more from a technology or framework point of view. For unit tests, you can actually use whatever you want that works in JavaScript, TypeScript. The project itself, like the underlying source code from the Theia project, mainly uses Mocha. And if you want to, like if you're a fan of homogeneity, then maybe you also stick to Mocha. However, you're not bound to that. You can also use Jest or whatever you want to do. If you want to know how a typical test could look like, the Yeoman template generator again contains a test example. So you can generate a Theia extension including a test, which you can then use as a template for your own tests. For system tests, meaning testing the whole application as the full application rather than only some classes or some subcomponents. Again, any system test framework would do. Over the last years, we have actually used most of them, or not most of them, but at least we use Cypress, Puppeteer, and Playwright. That's a personal experience from our side. Like we often discuss between different customer projects what works well and what experience we make with applying certain technology. And from that, my current recommendation would be Playwright. I think that from a complexity versus enablement point of view, I think it's the best trade-off at the moment. But that's really just a personal recommendation. Any other frameworks, maybe if you're completely familiar with Puppeteer or Cypress, you can also stick to that. What might be interesting though is when you write system tests, you typically, so if you control the UI with a test script, you have to identify UI elements. For example, you have to, let's say, open the file explorer and then open a certain file. That requires you to really kind of manually know, for example, the ID of DOM elements and so on. And to make this more comfortable to write tests, a page object model typically helps. And what that actually is it's kind of a helper framework that instead of manually searching for the menu to open the file explorer and then manually searching the file tree and then manually identifying a file, you could just say, okay, open file. And all the other stuff, because it's always the same in Theia, is abstracted in this page object model. And there's currently a contribution upcoming for such a page object model for Playwright in Theia. And I think we actually have a talk about that even today or I think today even. So definitely join that. Next question. And now we get, as you might see, we get in a little bit in the area of where the questions do not relate to each other so much anymore. But I I was really sticking to the most frequent questions, so there are some topic breaks now. Now, when you started to adopt Theia, you sooner or later you run into the questions and how to migrate to new Theia versions. Theia provides a new release every month, which is great because that allows to innovate at a fast pace. I mean, we don't rewrite our API every month. It's basically adding some new features, fixing some bugs, and so on. However, from time to time, there are necessary things that you need to do in your project if you adopt Theia. Like, for example, we switched to a new JavaScript version this year or to a new Webpack version this year. Sometimes we have to change or adopt APIs and so on. So there are, from time to time, changes you need to do as an adopter. Now, we actually changed this process or enhanced this process quite a bit this year. But let's first talk about an update strategy. So how often should you update to a new version? If you are during active development, like the tool is not yet deployed, I actually recommend to update early and often. if possible, every month, because that will allow you to detect migration steps early, and you will not pile up a long list of migration steps you have to do. Even though you have to do it often, it's probably less effort if you really follow the latest Theia versions there. Obviously, if you deployed your tool and you're in some sort of maintenance phase, that's not feasible anymore because you would need to retest, redeploy everything. I would still upgrade regularly and then watch for security fixes, like issues that are tagged with security if they affect you, and then potentially trigger a hot release if necessary. Now, what happened this year is in summer, an adopter approached us that they had issues with migrating to new Theia versions. And what we actually identified as one of the root causes is there are some companies adopting Theia that are very close to the core, like for example, Ericsson and Red Hat and so on. They adopt Theia very early and they fix the necessary things in the adoption project. But this experience, like what to adopt in a project, was nowhere captured. Of course, we had a changelog and we tried doing development to document what needs to be done, but it's hard to like completely capture everything that you need to be done as an adopter. Now, what we introduced to tackle that is we integrate. So we established this migration guide, and the idea of that is during development we already try to identify if some change that we do in the code requires a migration on the adopter side and document that. But we keep this document open to contributions even after a release is done. And now the idea is if an adopter migrates to a new version and finds out some things, some measurements that have to be taken in the adopting project, then we would like to receive contributions to this migration guide so that other adopters that do the same a little bit later can actually benefit from that. So the idea is kind of to jointly work on a migration database or guide and allow others to benefit from the experience that one adopter has done. Next question, which extension mechanism to use? I promised to answer this or to discuss this question before. Now, background for this is, and you might be aware of that, there are actually two extension mechanisms out there. One is what we call the VS Code extension. That mechanism is invented and provided by VS Code. The idea there is, VS Code is basically a tool that, really a code editor tool that is extensible. And the way it provides this extensibility is it provides an explicit API that extensions can use to interact with the host tool. Those extensions run in a separate process and they can only use this particular API. So extensions are very isolated. As a benefit, they cannot harm the stability of the host tool, or at least not so much, and they can be installed and uninstalled at runtime. Now, on the other hand, Theia extensions, and I hope I could visualize this, they're not like a second-class citizen. Actually, the core of Theia is made of those Theia extensions. So that's really a core concept in Theia. And in Theia, there is not this core or host tool, but everything a Theia application consists of is a Theia extension. And that means your own extensions that you write for Theia, if you use Theia extensions, play by the same rule as all the core extensions. As a consequence, you have a lot of power. You can basically access everything that the core can access. You can adapt almost anything. You can take stuff away, override stuff in the core, replace behavior, completely modify the UI, access the DOM, like full flexibility. As a downside, maybe two downsides, you cannot install Theia extensions at runtime. It used to be possible, but it was not really a strong requirement anymore. So currently it's not possible. But and the second is, because you have access to everything, there's not this smaller like defined API. So it's a little bit more complex to do that. However, like more possibilities or more power usually comes with more complexity. Now, what should you use? That's a very interesting question. You could, if you use a VS Code extension, it's probably simpler to get started with. You have this runtime installability, and maybe as a side benefit, whatever you implement is also compatible with VS Code. However, you might hit limits. And especially if you build custom tools and you really want to adapt the UI to your specific requirements, it's likely that you will hit something that you cannot do with VS Code. And there, it starts with simple things like you cannot remove menus, custom editors are tricky. So it's really depending on your particular feature. In turn, sorry, what? No, I lost track a little bit. So the typical approach would be most projects or many projects start with the VS Code extensions, but the core tool, meaning the core workbench description and core tool definition and customization, is actually done as Theia extension. And then only features that are kind of optional and maybe can even be installed by the user later on are implemented as a VS Code extension. So it's completely viable to mix those two concepts in a project, because then you can actually benefit from both benefits, or you can use the benefits of both solution. Right. Yeah, I forgot to mention this. I'm not sure whether I mentioned this. So I think I mentioned it previously in the talk. Theia supports VS Code extensions. That's actually why you even have the choice between Theia extensions and VS Code extensions. So both is definitely possible. All right. I also compiled an article about that, providing more details. The link is here on the slide. So you can definitely read more about this. One thing that I want to mention, there is a gray area between VS Code extensions and Theia extensions, and that is the like provision of custom UI, like for example, a custom view, a custom editor. So VS Code provides this concept of web views that actually allows you to provide custom UI. However, if you've used that once, it's definitely significantly more effort and more complex to provide a custom UI in VS Code. This goes for the actual implementation, but especially for the communication between your custom UI and the surrounding workbench. Like things, I don't know, for example, to interact with the problems view and an editor, very tricky in VS Code. You might be able to implement that in VS based on the VS Code API, but it will be significantly less effort and more convenient as Theia extension. So for that reason, it's sometimes even a good option to do a custom UI Theia extension, even if you could potentially do it as VS Code extension too. Speaking about implementing custom UIs and custom features, maybe a very quick overview of a technology, or a typical technology selection if you implement a web-based tool based on Theia. I actually did this as a comparison to technologies on Eclipse desktop, because I assume quite a large number of Theia adopters might have had a desktop based tool based on Eclipse before. If you had never an Eclipse based tool, just ignore the left column. So Eclipse platform replacement is Eclipse Theia, obviously. Workbench API, so menus, views, editors, and so on. Either the VS Code API if you do a VS Code extension, or Theia contribution points. SWT or JFace are gone. You use HTML, JavaScript, TypeScript, and potentially some UI frameworks for that. I would say in Theia, the most common choice is actually React for custom UI, but you could use also Angular or Vue or whatever you want. But the best support is there for React. Language support, combination of the language server protocol, text-made grammars for static syntax highlighting, the debug adapter protocol, plus potentially the VS Code extension API and contribution points again. Xtext. Good news is you can use Xtext in Theia too, because you can generate language servers using the Xtext framework. Diagrams like GMF or GEF, Eclipse GLSP, meaning the graphical language server protocol, is a framework for web-based diagram editors that is well integrated with Theia, and Sprotty is another diagram framework that GLSP is based on, which is especially focused on diagrams that are driven by a textual artifact. So if you, for example, have a DSL and you want to visualize that, and at the same time, then Sprotty is a good choice. The EMF ecosystem, in a nutshell, EMF Cloud is starting to build up an ecosystem that enables you to use the same concept provided by EMF in the cloud too, and also with a strong focus on Theia. And finally, form-based UIs. There's JSON forms, which provides also integration points with Theia already, for example, as a property view or as a tree editor. If you want to see an example on how these different technologies work together, there's the so-called coffee editor provided by the EMF Cloud project. That's an open source example, including an online demo on how to build a domain-specific or modeling tool based on Theia. And it contains all the technologies I've just mentioned and even more, like a code generator, C++ tooling, and so on. So if you want to see what's possible and maybe also search for an example, like a blueprint on how to integrate those things and build those features, definitely have a look. It's available open source, obviously. Okay, now we leave a little bit the technical part and talk about how to communicate with the community, which is an essential, also an essential part of starting to adopt Theia. Now, how to communicate with the community. And we as a community, we're very happy if you communicate with us, because only if you do that, we can learn about your issues and help you as good as we can, which is our goal as a project. So we want to make it as easy as possible for you to adopt Theia and as successful as possible. So definitely the community forum I mentioned before. Use GitHub issues to report issues or even feature requests you have. Don't be shy. You don't have to fix them. We want to know about feature requests and bugs. That's a valuable contribution. There are weekly developer calls. So once a week, there's an open call where everybody can join. And especially if you're new to the project, we invite you to join there, tell us about your use case, see some faces of the core contributors, join there anytime, and you can even add something to the agenda. And of course, events like the event today and tomorrow, TheiaCon. The other big event where Theia is represented a lot is obviously the Eclipse Con. Finally, how to contribute to the Theia project. If you start to adopt Theia, you might sooner or later also think about how to contribute to it. Why should you do that? First of all, there might be some features that you miss in Theia, some bugs that you hit in Theia. So you can actually change that, and you can also influence the direction and make the project even more successful. Now, what are contributions that we're looking for? It's not only code. It's actually even asking a question is a valuable contribution, because it tells us, okay, there is something unclear, maybe something to improve. Of course, also answering questions. So if you are active in the forum and answer the questions of other users, very valuable contribution. Reporting bugs is very helpful, because that shows the project what to fix and how to improve stability. Reporting feature requests, because that shows guides the core committers in the strategic direction of the project, and we actually learn what adopters need. Contributing to the migration guide I've mentioned before. And then finally, of course, providing pull requests for bug fixes, feature implementation, tests, API docs, and general documentation. So all of this is very welcome. You don't have to start with huge feature. A small fix to the documentation is already a great contribution. Don't be shy. We're very happy to welcome you there and help you and guide you through the first contribution. Contribution process in a nutshell, when we think about code, what you should definitely do first is report something that you want to do and communicate early, so we know what you're working on, because then we can provide some early feedback. Maybe somebody's already working on that, or we have some previous knowledge. You develop your solution on a branch, typically in a fork. If you're not a committer, you create a PR. You need to have signed the ECA. I will talk about that in a second. We will review your PR. Expect some feedback. So we are very keen on quality, and we want to really review the code in a way to optimize it. So there's almost never a PR where there's no feedback, but that's from our point of view a good thing. You address the review comments, and then the PR is merged. About this contribution agreement that might be special, you might not know that from other open source project. What you basically agree to with this agreement is that you submit the code under the respective license, which is the Eclipse public license. and you confirm that you have the rights to do so. Now, every contribution done to the Theia project and also other Eclipse project is covered by such an agreement, and that actually provides a IP shield. That means companies adopting Theia in a commercial context can be pretty certain that there's no code in there that shouldn't be there. So this is really a good thing for adopters. And it's a small thing for you to agree to. Usually it's easy to agree. What might be something you should keep in mind, if you do the contributions in as part of your work, your employer actually has to agree to that. Good first areas to contribute. The team regularly marks good first issues. They're typically simple to do, but great to get started. We mark issues where we want help on explicitly. And definitely, it's also valuable to focus on issues that you experience in your own project. So that's not a bad thing. Just, you can definitely work on the stuff that is important for you. Completely fine and foreseen. If you want to learn how to contribute in practice, there will be a hackathon in January. So join us. I will post a link in the chat later on. And committers will actually guide you through your first contribution so you can learn what all this means in practice. And with that, so because Tim already talked about the working group, so I will skip that and rather finish and ask whether there are any questions. I was not able to follow the chat, so I'm happy, Brian, if you could help me to highlight any questions.
Yes, I will, Jonas. I'll feed you some questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Right. So question one is, can you please refer to the new Gitpod Open VS Code server versus Theia? So I guess that's like what differentiates them. What use cases are they both solving for?
Yeah, so the Open VS Code server is basically, so VS Code provides the an online mode since almost 2 years now in a beta version that's GitHub Codespaces, but they never open sourced the server solution that you need to run VS Code in the browser. So Gitpod and a couple of other partners decided to actually implement the server part in an open source version to enable this use case. And now, as far as I've read, quite recently, Microsoft then decided to open the core implementation of the server. So there are now 2 implementation of the server there. How this relates to Theia, it enables to run VS Code in the browser, like the tool. That's it. So there's no direct connection to Theia of this server. It shows a little bit shows a little bit the difference. Like in Theia, it would probably not happen that it wouldn't never happen that a feature is actually developed closed source, and then there's a fork of that or an alternative developed, and then the original is open source because everything in Theia is open and open sourced from the start. Next, I hope this answers the question. Next question, please.
Yeah, I'm going to be just jumping through them because of time limitations. The next one is, Vince already answered this, but you could give your take. Is Blueprint only for desktop, or can it be extended for the browser too?
So the current version is for desktop only, but we are working on a browser-based version for the same thing. Because it definitely makes sense to also have a browser-based Blueprint.
Next question. Are templates available for Playwright usage in Theia?
I think they are part of the contribution, yes. So there, the link was on the slide.
Yeah. Next question. What about embeddability in existing web apps? For example, taking apart the UI and embedding the navigator extension outside the workbench even?
Depends a little bit. So we have done some similar things. It's not super easy to do because there are some dependencies on the underlying workbench. It depends a little bit on the component. If a component is implemented in a way that the split between framework concerns and the UI is pretty clean, then it's very simple to also use them outside of Theia. A good example is a GLSP editor like the graphical diagram editor, it's very easy to embed this on a plain website and also embed it into Theia. For the core UI elements of Theia, I would claim it's not so easy. I would rather than like remove all the stuff from Theia that you don't want to see and rather really display a Theia version with only the UI you want, rather than like stripping this down. Although if you're interested in reusing a particular UI element, I would just evaluate that. And if it's tricky to do, it's probably better to refactor it in a way to enable your use case to compared to completely re-implementing that. So if you have a concrete use case, we are happy to learn about that.
And if you can answer this in 15 seconds, is it possible to create the components for a workspace using Terraform or a similar tool? Would it be difficult to add support for that?
Terraform?
Yeah.
What is Terraform? Like,
okay.
Where's the question? I cannot answer that. I'm sorry.
The questions. It was in the chat as well, but it's popped up in the question and answers. It's up the third question. Well, that's fine. Let's continue the chat. I'll post a reminder about the Slack workspace where we can have more discussions. There's a TheiaCon 2021 channel in our Cloud Dev Tools Slack workspace. So please come on over. So with that, we've ran out of time for this section, and thank you very much to Jonas. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.